Hello again. I'd like to make a few comments in support of the information you'll be dealing with this week, which is text chapter 10. Deals with the Baroque era. This is roughly 1600 to 1750. This is a time that is characterized by a number of important cultural factors that affect music as well as all of the other arts. For the first time, the aristocracy and wealthy business people, wealthy merchants, come to be on the same footing as the church in terms of their ability to patronize or support the arts. The product of that is art across all of the various disciplines, music, literature, architecture, theater, become very highly ornamented. And I'd like to show you a few examples of that in addition to what you will be seeing in the text. King Louis XIV of France had a very long reign, about 70 years or so, and what you're looking at here is a picture of his palace in the town of Versailles, which is about 20 miles southwest of Paris. All of the buildings that you see back here, these are all parts of the king's palace. This is the front gate. You can see that it's gold, and it's very highly ornamented. You get a little closer look up at the huge complex of buildings behind it. This is a sort of a panoramic shot of the buildings as well. This is me looking at one of the tapestries. I'm a trumpet player, and I was a little surprised by the look of this trumpet player, but the walls of the palace are covered with very elaborate tapestries. Woven carpets that are huge and very detailed. This is the ceiling of the Opera House, one of the buildings on the campus, we'll call it, is an opera house, and that's what the ceiling of it looks like. You can see that the whole thing is very highly ornamented. Here is an example of a large painting. So the aristocracy, the king in this case, commissioned paintings, he commissioned tapestries, he commissioned music, supported the arts. The concept of patronage is something that is very important going forward from the late Renaissance all the way through to modern times. This is the main hallway, view from a little bit of a distance. Elaborate gardens all the way around the place. Here's a closer view of the main hallway. This is the Queen's bedroom. So you can see, you get the idea. Lots of very highly ornamented things going on in the decor, and this characterizes the entire period of the Baroque era. So, numerous changes begin to take place in music as a result of these new sources of patronage. Instrumental music becomes as important as vocal music for the first time, and some of this week's terms relate to that. Secular music, non-religious music, also becomes equally as important as liturgical or religious or church music. Music becomes a little more characterized by sharp contrasts, going from loud to soft or fast to slow or major to minor keys. In other words, the way composers deal with the basic elements of music changes. Part of the reason for that is because they needed to satisfy their patrons. So the complex polyphony that you hear in the Bach-Richter-Carr, that sort of writing, that continues throughout the Baroque period. Bach is a Baroque composer, but there is much more homophonic music, much more music with melody and accompaniment. The texture is much simpler to make sense of, as I expect you may already be hearing in your work. Just a couple other quick points before I get to this week's terms. This time period marks the beginning and early development of opera. You'll read a little bit about that in this chapter. There will be more relation to it as we come forward through the history of Western art music as well. Finally, I'm going to get into the terms, begin with the very first one, continuo. All right? This usually consists of a bass instrument, most often a cello, occasionally a bassoon, and the harpsichord. I am posting the link to the harpsichord video that you looked at earlier on the introductory notes so that you can go back and look at it and remind yourself of what a harpsichord is, what it sounds like, how it produces sound and all of that, because it is the bedrock of much music from this time period. Opera, very simply, a dramatic stage presentation with music as its central focus. So it is like a play set to music. Bel canto, this is the lyrical style of singing. What happens over time as opera begins to develop, it begins as just storytelling, sung storytelling. It didn't take composers very long to realize that this was probably not going to be incredibly interesting after a while, so they began alternating between pieces of music that would show off the singer's virtuosity, along with pieces that would give you more plot information. So, a recitative is a piece for solo voice, usually rubato, sung in a speech-like rhythm, very soft accompaniment so that you can hear the words clearly. These pieces of music are used to give you plot information, to move the story forward. An aria is something with repeated music. It is something where, once again, it's a solo genre of vocal composition, but it focuses on allowing the singer to show off his or her virtuosity. An oratorio is something that looks a lot like an opera. There's a chorus, a large group of singers, 4 soloists, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass in most cases. And there's a large amount of text, sometimes taken from the Bible. Occasionally there are secular oratorios as well. The things that are missing are scenery, stage action, and like that. Oratorios are presented in a concert style. As I mentioned, much more instrumental music begins to happen during this time period, and we have much more of it preserved in writing. Sonata, just a multi-movement work, usually 3 movements for a solo instrument, and continuo. So it could be a violin sonata, a flute sonata, that sort of thing. Composers are still writing in this genre as they are writing concertos, 3-movement work, rather than being accompanied by just continuo. The soloist is accompanied by an orchestra. Orchestras at this time were at first just strings, and then a few woodwind instruments are added later on. And by the time we get to the end of the Baroque era, there are brass instruments, horns, trumpets, and timpani as well. But the orchestras are much smaller than what you saw in the instrumentation video, the Britten Young Person's Guide, back at the beginning of the term. Concerto grosso, just a different kind of concerto for more than one soloist, 2 or more soloists with orchestral accompaniment. Antiphonal music, very interesting. At the end of the Renaissance and the beginning of the Baroque era, composers began writing music to be played by 2 groups that would play back and forth and occasionally together. There's a little bit of text about that in the chapter that you'll be working with. I mentioned patronage, very important. Iconography, this is the study of art to learn about other things. So we know about certain instruments, for example, not because they're examples of the instruments themselves around, but because people painted pictures of musicians showing the instruments, and historians and other interested parties were able to recreate the instruments based on that. Regarding your coursework for this coming time period, as usual, textbook chapter 10 and TH10, the assignment that goes along with that, with the usual 1-week timeline for submission. NT10 has 2 things that I want you to write about. The first is a recitative and an aria from an oratorio written by George Friedrich Handel, along with J.S. Bach, probably the most well-known Baroque composer. These 2 pieces of music, short pieces for solo voice, in this case a tenor, and orchestra, they come from the Messiah, an oratorio he wrote in the early 1740s, and you will recognize a piece from that in this evening's listening assignment as well. So, the first one is writing about the recitative and aria from this oratorio. The second one is writing about this piece. This piece of music is a set of 4 concertos, each of which have 3 movements. They're all rolled together into one large work. All I want you to listen to is the very first movement of the first concerto. It's programmatic music, and I have written out a description of what goes on in the music right here. You can follow along with it as you listen once or twice. and you will see what I'd like you to write about it. I want you to describe music in terms of how Vivaldi paints a picture in music of a short poem, a sonnet, that he also wrote himself. So, I hope you enjoy listening to and writing about just this very small sample of music from this very florid, highly ornamented, productive period in music history. Thank you.